Hi everybody, it's me, Fatty, hopefully your new favorite food enthusiast. Here to walk you through another really great recipe. Today we're going to be doing a vegan vanilla cake. I myself am not vegan, but I have a lot of vegan friends and a lot of people who I love, and it used to always really make me sad when they would take me out and they would provide me with like a treat, and they'd be like, oh, try this vegan cake, and it almost always tasted and felt like bread. And I'd be so disappointed because I love cake, and I would think to myself, man, that really sucks. Like, you shouldn't feel like you're missing out on something because you decided to do something really great and like change your lifestyle. And so I kind of made it a mission to make all alternative diet foods, as many as I possibly can, be as close to their original counterpart as possible. So that brings me to today's recipe. So when you look at your recipe, I actually construct my recipes a little bit differently than the traditional format because my brain doesn't kind of work the same way as other people, and so instead of kind of fighting against my nature, I just found ways to adapt traditional processes, which also makes sense about like my cooking and my take on food, into what works for me. So I always loved, I'm such a nerd, but I loved the structure of an agenda because it kind of gives you in a brief glance exactly what your expectations are. So if you look at your recipe, there's pre-baked steps, there's like a quick overview of like how the ingredients are going to get incorporated into each other, so it's not just a list. And that way, you won't be suddenly surprised if halfway through the recipe you mix all these things and then it's like, boil a cup of water. Okay, you could have told me that at the beginning because now I have to wait and I don't know how that's going to affect everything else. So take a look at the recipe format, familiarize yourself with it. I hope you find it helpful and more kind of accessible. So with that, let's jump right in. I'm super excited. Okay, so the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna do our pre-baked steps. Before I even turn on the oven to preheat it, I'm going to curdle some soy milk because we're gonna need this. Actually, what I'm using is not soy milk, I misspoke. It is a vegan milk, but I'm using Ripple. It's a pea protein. And the reason why I use that is because it works really well in baking, and it doesn't have, like, it reduces the number of allergies because it's not a nut milk and there's no soy in, etc. Okay, so I'm just using some apple cider vinegar. I'm gonna start with 1 tablespoon. So 1 tablespoon didn't do much, so I'm gonna actually add another. And don't worry, it's not gonna impart flavor. And that ought to do the trick. And the reason why we're doing it early on is because we want this to happen, and so the longer we let it wait, the better it's gonna be. So we're just gonna set it aside now. Okay. We're also going to, remember I mentioned boiling water? We're gonna do that. So we're gonna actually, I have 1.5 cups of water measured here. I'm just gonna pour it right into my saucepan. I'm gonna cover it up. I'm gonna put it on the stovetop behind me. And we're gonna put it on medium-low because I need it to boil by the time I'm ready to mix all my ingredients, so it doesn't need to boil immediately. And now I'm gonna preheat my oven to 350. All right, all our pre-baked steps are done, and now we can get right into it. So in this recipe, it calls for, I give you kind of the freedom, the creative freedom to use whatever boiling liquid you want, okay? You can get wild. This is really kind of a base recipe, so you can add and infuse whatever flavors you want, okay? For the liquids, you could do, I mentioned water, coffee, tea, and infused vegan milk. Essentially what you can do is if you want to infuse a flavor, so say for instance you want to try, I don't know, an herb like mint or basil or rosemary or something like that, you bring your milk to a gentle simmer, you throw in your herbs and you cover it up and set it aside, okay? And you take out the herbs once it gets to room temp, and then you're gonna have to heat it up again, but that's not a big deal because it'll have like this added flavor, which hopefully will come through, okay? Experiment, play, and let me know what you guys come up with. I love these combinations. Okay. So I'm gonna do 3 6-inch pans. You can do 8-inch pans, you can do 9-inch pans, but you might have to increase the amount of batter because it depends, like you wanna fill it up 2/3 of the way, so like up to here. And so if you're not filling it up that much, you'll just end up with like really thin cakes, which is fine, but they'll just bake a lot faster and they'll be more like a pancake. Okay, so you can increase the recipe batter size by 1.5, and you should be able to do a bigger cake, but 6-inch is what we're gonna go with. Before I even grease it, I have parchment paper. Unfortunately, parchment paper almost always is sold in a cylindrical rectangle. And pans are almost always circular. So like, what are you gonna do, right? You roll out your parchment paper and you measure it against your pan. This is about 6 inches long. You're gonna tear it, you're gonna lay it down, and we're gonna fold it, okay? We're gonna fold it in half. I always like to fold towards like the clean edges because these are obviously uneven. I'm gonna turn it, I'm gonna fold it in half again. Okay, now these are my 2 creases. I'm gonna always fold towards the creases, okay? We're gonna fold and make a triangle. We're gonna make one more triangle. And it's almost like a conical shape, it's like a cone. And you can do it one more time. We're gonna do this 3 times, so I'll walk you through this 3 times. Take your pan, flip it upside down, and we're gonna find kind of roughly the center point. Like, I don't really know where the center point is, but I'm gonna guess here, and I'm gonna measure against my finger. So I wanna cut basically right here to create a circle, okay? And if you cut it at a curve, it'll actually create like a beautiful scallop circle. Okay, so I mark it with my finger, and now I'm going to cut. All right, so here's my circle, and fold, and fold, and fold, and there it is, okay? And this should fit right into your pan. If it's a little bit big, you can fold it back up and trim it. That's what I'm gonna do. All right, and we're gonna repeat that process 2 more times. There we go, there's 1, and 2. So I'm gonna fold that in half. And it doesn't matter that it's tore, it doesn't matter that it's wrinkled. All of that is inconsequential. So I'm gonna turn it, fold it again. And notice that I'm actually like, because these papers are so wildly uneven, I'm actually gonna match the corners. Okay, so even though they don't fully line up, that's okay. So again, we're gonna fold towards our creased edges. We'll fold it again. And one more time. Set it aside. All right. We're going to do it again with this piece of parchment. Fold it into a long rectangle. Turn it and fold it again. Turn it so my creases are here again. I'm going to make a triangle. And if you end up folding it like away from the creases and cutting it, what will end up happening is you cut 2 semicircles that are separate. And you can still use them. It's not a big deal. Okay? So I'm going to measure against this guy and give it a cut. Great. So now we are going to spray our pans. Make sure that you spray the bottom and all around the edges. We're going to do a very generous coating. And now we're going to lay in the circles we just cut. Here's circle 1. Circle 2. And circle 3. All right, so that is all set. Our pans are done, our milk is curdled, and we have our water boiled. We're now actually ready to get right into this. Okay, so here I have 1 3/4 cup of regular all-purpose flour. I have 2 cups of sugar, and here I have 1 1/2 cups of cake flour. Okay, the reason why I'm using 2 different types of flour. When you're making cake, remember how I talked about it needs to be fluffy and like a sponge and not dense like a bread? Because in vegan baking, we're not using eggs. Eggs, when they're blended, they create and hold air pockets, okay? The proteins hold air pockets. And so as the cake rises, those bubbles actually burst, and then the gluten holds it together, okay? Now, in vegan baking, we obviously don't have eggs, okay? So we need to do a combination of all-purpose flour, which is denser and heavier, and something that's going to be lighter to help hold that structure, or help it kind of give it a lighter weight, so that the lack of eggs and the lack of protein isn't going to compromise the structure of the cake, so it still remains a little bit spongy. So cake flour is basically this product. This is a bleach enriched version, and then there's this version which is not King Arthur. They're both going to function the same. I believe they have cornstarch in them, or some sort of wheat starch, and that's what gives it a little bit more lightness, and that's why I have tried this many different ways. You can use all-purpose flour for the whole thing. That's okay. You'll just end up with a denser cake that'll be more like a pound cake and less like a sponge. Just manage your expectations, okay? So I have my main dries, and then I have my baking soda, 1.5 teaspoons, 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, and 1 teaspoon of fine grained sea salt, okay? And we're gonna put that in, and this is literally all just gonna get whisked together. Now, remember I mentioned this is a very base recipe. You can spice this up by adding a tablespoon of cinnamon, you can add some nutmeg, you can add some allspice, you can add some cloves, you can turn it into a spice cake. I wouldn't recommend adding cocoa. There's a little bit more science to that. So like with vegan baking, I kind of have a different kind of recipe for each type of thing. I also did not make this gluten-free. Like this cake works well vegan, or it works well gluten-free. It doesn't really work well both vegan and gluten-free. That's still a recipe that I'm working on developing, and hopefully when I have it, I will share it with whoever wants to know. Okay, our dries are whisked, they are set. We're gonna set them aside, and we're gonna start working on our wet ingredients. For our wet ingredients, don't forget we have our curdled milk, which looks, okay, it looks not so great, but that's actually exactly what we want, I know. And instead of dirtying another measuring cup, I'm gonna actually measure directly in here the amount of oil that I need, which is 1/2 cup. So I have a cup in here, so I'm just gonna bring it up to 1.5 cups. This is gonna go into my large mixing bowl. And save this measuring cup because we're gonna need it to measure out 1 cup of boiling hot water. And then we're gonna add 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. And we're gonna whisk this pretty vigorously because I think it's important, especially when you're working with an oil, to try and emulsify it, to basically get it to break apart and homogenize with the other liquids that it's with. This looks great to me. So now we're just gonna put our dry mix into our wet. As a rule of thumb with baking and cake making, you always want to, if you're mixing wets and dries and you're doing it in multiple batches, you always want to start dry and end dry. Because whenever you add a wet ingredient, it tends to break your batter, which makes it look kind of chunky, almost like a cheese, which is not the texture that we really want in our batter. There. So when we add our wet and our dry, you're gonna create this very thick batter. And that's okay, because once we add our boiling water, or our boiling liquid, whatever you use, it's gonna thin it out. The most important thing here is that we're scraping from the bottom and bringing up to make sure that there are no dry pockets. Okay, that was a cup. So we're gonna basically switch from spatula to whisk. Keep your spatula handy though, because we will be using it. And you pour in your boiling water. Start whisking away. Whisk away slowly at first, because you don't want all the water to slosh out. This is also why we use a large bowl. And slowly but surely, I always start from the center and I whisk in like a very small circle. And then I start spreading outwards. If you're using a mixer, this should like take a minute. And now we're gonna distribute amongst our 3 cakes. And I'm just gonna go in. Let's do a cup there. This is about what I mean. It's like 2/3 of the way, so it's like 1 knuckle. So like, this is how much empty space there is. So you want about 1/2 inch of empty space. So that way it gives it an opportunity to rise. And what happens is, go ahead and put these in the oven. So we're gonna put them to bake for 25, we'll check them in 25 minutes, and then we'll check every 5 minutes after that. And so what I was explaining was the reason why we actually leave that much space for a cake is what happens is when a cake rises, this is essentially chemically what's happening. The steam is rising, it's boiling, and so it's creating these bubbles and they're trying to escape the surface. As you've seen when you're cooking a sauce or something, you see these bubbles burst. So what happens is with a cake is that they're rising and the gluten is holding the structure together. And as they manage to make their way up and pop, the gluten holds the bridge, and that's how you get all these little circles. But also what's happening is it's clinging to the sides of the pan and trying to hold itself up. So if you don't leave enough space for it to do that, it'll just collapse, okay? Or it'll boil over. Both are not great scenarios. So that's the same thing with cupcakes, the same thing with souffles actually, but souffles are more egg whites. A little bit different chemically, but essentially the same thought process behind it. But at this stage, all we do is wait and then we'll check. And yeah, I'll see you guys in 25 minutes. Hi guys, so I am about 3 minutes away from my timer going off for 25 minutes. And I wanted to talk to y'all a little bit about what to do if you open the oven and the cake is clearly not ready. So when given baking times, it's usually kind of advisory. Like within this window, we expect it to be completed and done. But it really depends on the temperature of your oven. Every oven is going to be a little bit different. Believe it or not, altitude impacts it, the temperature outside, the humidity. So there are a lot of other factors that come into play. And it varies depending on the baked product you're creating. Okay, that being said, if you open the oven and say it's been baking for 20 minutes and your recipe says 30 minutes and you touch the rack and you see everything wiggling. Okay, my advice, do not touch the cake pans. Don't poke them, don't prod them, don't move them, leave them be. And very gently but quickly close your oven door. Every time you open the oven, 10% of the heat escapes. So we don't want to keep checking and opening. We just kind of have to build this like baker's intuition and trust your gut. Trust that you know that you're doing the right thing, okay? That is very critical because it's going to take time for the heat to rebuild every time you open the oven. So in terms of leaving cakes that are clearly raw untouched, if you touch them, you run the risk of deflating them. Remember that process I talked about the bubbles? Well, essentially the bubbles are very volatile at this stage. So any tap can basically encourage them to release very quickly and it'll sink the center of your cake. We don't want that to happen, or at least we want to avoid that as much as possible. If it does happen, sometimes it's unavoidable depending on the recipe. It happens often with my gluten-free stuff. It's still okay. Like, it doesn't mean that it's destroyed. It just means that we haven't gotten the full rise or the full potential of your cake. That's all. So check it, and if you see that it's still super raw, add 10 minutes immediately to your total time. Just immediately add 10 minutes. I promise you, it'll probably still need even more time than that, okay? Anyway, my timer is about to go off, so I'm going to cancel it. I'm just going to go ahead and look at my cakes and see what's going on. Ooh, look at that. All right. So here are my cakes. I have a really good rise. I can tell that some of them, yeah, they're still pretty wet in the center. So I'm just going to close it right back up, give it 10 minutes. Here we go. So I'm going to pull out my rack. They look golden brown. I'm just going to put this in the center. Coming out perfectly clean. Examine our cakes. So obviously still very, very hot, but we got a really good rise on it, even though it doesn't have any eggs. It's vegan. This is fantastic. And it's gonna make a great stacked layer cake. So we got our vegan cake done, and now it's a matter of, well, what do we do with it? Obviously, you can enjoy it as is, but you want to let it cool. We will unpan our cakes together in the next video, and together we'll make a vegan Swiss meringue buttercream. I will teach you some variations, and we will stack and layer this cake together, and I'll show you that process. So until then, stay tuned. enjoy this cake, bake another one for the next video, and let me know what you think. And hopefully I will see you then.